I'd like to switch to our first panel today. It's called An EV Future for Everyone, Equity and Multifamily Charging. And the participants will be Rebecca Lucky, an apartment resident, Dr. Andrea Marpillero-Colomina of Green Latinos, and Vanessa Morelan of the EV Equity Advocate, and Chris Chavez for the Coalition of Clean Air. So take it away, panelists. See, I'm not sure if anyone has which one or who is going to go first, but why don't we have let's see, Andrea, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I was assuming there would be a question, but good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on what coast you're in, what time zone you're in. My name is Andrea Marpillero-Colomina. I'm the Sustainable Communities Program Director at Green Latinos. Green Latinos is a nationwide nonprofit that focuses on the environmental and conservation priorities for Latino communities. Obviously not exclusively Latino communities, but the issues that affect them most. And in our work on EVs, we really focus on these essential equity questions, right? First of all, there's a lot of focus on, how to get consumers to purchase EVs from a purely financial standpoint, and not a lot of consideration or sort of thought given. And this is sort of the qualitative part of policymaking that can be really challenging, but this sort of focus on what's holding people back from buying an EV in the first place that may not be 100% financially related, right? So the big thing that holds people back, about, I think it's like 70% of potential EV buyers, is fear of lack of access to charging infrastructure, and fear of range anxiety, right? Fear that they're going to run out of a charge during their commute or in a remote area, and not have a place that's accessible to them in order to refuel their vehicle or recharge their vehicle efficiently. And the other thing that I think is really important to think about, right, is much of the charging infrastructure that we've seen so far has really been pushed forth, and sometimes as exclusively owned by either automobile manufacturers themselves or private companies, right? And so that sort of liberation of the marketplace, number one, sends a really clear message to folks that, like, this is not being publicly provided and is not necessarily accessible to the public. So like a Tesla brand charger is only for Teslas, right? And the location of these chargers is not equitably distributed, right? And so folks, particularly in Black and Brown communities, right, are not seeing chargers being located in their communities. They're not being put into places that are necessarily accessible to them. They're not being explained. I live in New York, where last summer the Department of Transportation and the local utility Con Edison started an 100 port EV charging port pilot, and kind of like sprinkled these curbside chargers all over the city. I work in this field, so I know what that is, right? But if I'm just a person living my life in my neighborhood and suddenly this like weird pole with two, electric extension cords comes out, shows up, like, I'm not going to necessarily know what that is. I might have a lot of questions about how much it costs. And all of that goes into that. So, with that, I think I'll open, I want to turn it over to my fellow panelists, because I think there's a lot to say. And I think that the conversation between us, I think, is going to get really excited when we sort of hear, what are those sort of touch points that everybody is thinking about.
Yeah, Vanessa, why don't we pass it to you? You kind of reacted to Andrea's last comment, so it'd be great to hear your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to participate today at this wonderful event. My name is Vanessa, and I'm a clean mobility advocate based in California's Bay Area. I call San Jose home. I most recently contributed to EV Noir and EV Hybrid Noir, which is an equity mobility organization, as our Western States program manager, supporting electric mobility best practices, as well as electric mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. prior to that role, I had the amazing opportunity as well to nurture clean mobility more locally within the Bay Area through the Bay Area Clean Cars for All program, where I helped the launch and initial program cycles of that program, where we helped community residents retire older aging vehicles and replace them with clean vehicles, and partnered that with access to vehicle charging infrastructure through grants or prepaid charge cards. And many of the participants in those programs are multifamily residents. Many are Black and Brown folks stemming from, various communities here in California, which is, really why we need to continue to support intentional deployment of charging infrastructure for multifamily residents, and exactly why we're here convening today, advocating, having these conversations to make sure we're continuing to advance equitable deployment of this infrastructure for multifamily residents. So really excited to be here and contribute to today's discussion. I'll go ahead and pass it over to Chris.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Chavez. I'm the Deputy Policy Director at Coalition for Clean Air, and appreciate this conference today as this is actually quite personal for me because I'm just above the moderate income line, living in an apartment located in a disadvantaged census tract. And I think the difference for me is that I have access to a garage, whereas a lot of my neighbors don't, and they have to hunt for parking. Even like looking in my own neighborhood, on one side of a street, Magnolia Avenue, you have a lot of single family homes, which have, and the number of EVs in that neighborhood is much higher than it is in the site of Magnolia Avenue that I live in, which is predominantly renters, predominantly Latino, predominantly lower income. And seeing that sort of disparity from just crossing the street is pretty glaring once you start working in this field for a while. So certainly I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in making sure that all folks have access to clean transportation, whether that is through personal vehicles, electric cars or EVs, things like that, as well as looking at other modes of transportation and really looking at opportunities for mode shifting towards public and shared transportation, and really trying to hammer in on that. To the governor's credit, as Commissioner Moynihan just mentioned, there is a proposal for massive investments in clean transportation. There were, last year was a historic amount of investment as well. And so certainly there's a lot of good news in terms of trying to promote transportation equity, but again, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I'll kick it off to the next person.
Yeah, nice. Thank you all. I just learned from Actera that our panelist, excuse me, Rebecca Lucky won't be able to make it today due to a family emergency. So that's why she wasn't able to be here today. But I guess so. Just to kind of follow up, I suppose one of the questions that comes to mind for me is how do we? I think one of the questions I have is, are there community members that are people interested in owning EVs right now? Are people coming out and asking, like, I'd like to test drive one, I'd like to get into one? Like, how is there actually a barrier in just that sort of desire or interest in an electric vehicle because of range anxiety, because of charging? Do they feel like, oh, that's not for me? Because I think that's kind of one of the first bridges, is just getting people to want to be in an EV, and because then there will become demand. The demand for EV charging will come. So I kind of wonder if there's are you hearing in your communities people saying, yes, we want EVs in our communities?
I think there's a couple of different things going on here. I think number one, we've got to acknowledge that the majority of people who buy cars in the United States of America are buying used cars. So like the financial availability of an EV is limited to many people. The very rapid advancement in EV car technology and charger technology, but let's start with the cars, in the past 5 years even, right, makes it so that like buying a used EV, unless it's a very new used EV, is not is not really a good investment, right? Because it doesn't hold as long as a charge, it's slower, it takes long, there are all these sort of pieces that go into that. The other thing that I think is really important, right, is that it's an unfamiliar technology, right? Most people who are drivers know the deal. You buy a car, you go to the gas station, you fill up your tank, you buy a soda and a donut, and you're on your way. And this is a completely new paradigm in every part of the experience of being a driver. And so I think that's a really real hesitation, right? A really real question people are asking. And I'd say in particular in Latino communities, right? And not exclusively Latino communities, obviously, but there are a lot of folks that own gas stations, that work in the car industry, right? Are mechanics, et cetera. And so if you are saying oh, hey, we're rolling out this car that essentially doesn't have any use for this industry, right? You are raising a lot of questions in those communities about, what their livelihoods will be when car mechanics and gas stations are obsolete. And I think that's a sort of soft policy concern that really needs to be addressed. I think absolutely people, particularly in Black and Brown communities and low-income communities, are disproportionately harmed by vehicle tailpipe emissions. They disproportionately live near polluting transportation infrastructure. They understand firsthand because they have asthma, their child has asthma, their mother has asthma, their neighbor has asthma, et cetera, that there's a really direct line between, gas-powered cars driving, or let alone trucks, right? But gas-powered cars driving around your neighborhood and pollute or driving next to your neighborhood on the interstate and releasing pollutant emissions. I think there is interest. I think there's been a real disconnect in the way that EVs are sort of marketed and how those incentives for buying EVs are marketed. I also think it's a little bit, you're sort of framing, and of course this is a super popular and sort of market-driven logical framing, right? Once people buy EVs, the demand for charging stations will increase, right? The charging stations will rise to meet the demand. But if there are no charging stations, you as a consumer can't visualize where you're gonna charge your car, right? So you're well, I can't buy a car because there's nowhere in my neighborhood to charge it, right? So we've got a little bit of a chicken and egg situation going on here with the EV vehicles and the EV charging infrastructure. And I think that is something that, policy and policy advocates, including me, right, need to do a much better job of sort of addressing, right? And not sort of creating this dynamic of oh, well, eventually the charging will catch up, because that's not a convincing sell to folks.
I can add some quick comments there, bring in some perspectives from the incentive landscape. My time working with the Clean Cars for All program, a good amount of our participants are multifamily residents, really showing the interest in accessing an electric vehicle. However, as they continue to navigate the program, two main barriers really come up, which we see illuminated in the chat, as well as Dr. Colomina's comments here, regarding the vehicle cost itself. As we see right now, the average cost of a vehicle is extremely high. So even though some are expressing interest into making that swap, it's financially inaccessible still. The average cost of an EV right now, or non-EV, hovering around $23,000, $25,000. That's really difficult to make that purchase, even when you are getting that vehicle incentive from California, which can extend up to $9,500, or if you're stacking, sometimes up to $14,000. But sometimes that's eliminating you from getting a used vehicle. You have to purchase a new. And then, once you're starting to look towards charging, and if you're living in a multifamily setting, some people get really discouraged from going forward with that purchase and then continue on with their gas vehicle, thinking this is not a fit for me. I don't have charging on site. I don't have charging in my neighborhood. How am I going to actually see the benefit of financial savings from making the switch to an electric vehicle if I can't, one, get myself into the vehicle by making these payments, or I have the fear of not being able to fuel my vehicle? So there's interest, but there's still a lot of barriers. And I still think there is an education and engagement gap still to really get to those communities that need to get in these vehicles the most.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that there is an issue for consumer preference, but there's also an issue for practicality. Yeah, you know, when you look around, trucks are popular. You know, these big trucks are popular, and it's you know, or you know, on the other side of that, you have also the fact that you know it is expensive to purchase a vehicle, and a lot of the vehicles that are being purchased are being purchased through used or used vehicles. A lot of leasing agreements as well. You know, I think what's important to remember though is that, especially with high gas prices right now, that low and moderate income earners are the most hurt by high gasoline prices, because then they oftentimes have the highest driving needs because they have to commute further. Their job requires a lot more commuting as part of the on-the-job activities. So that there are some massive challenges, and they also tend to have the older vehicles, which are less fuel efficient. So certainly there's also a practicality element in terms of helping EV deployment. But I think Vanessa is 100% right that we need to overcome the perception and the reality of both vehicle costs and also infrastructure costs. I think part of that can be overcome through better education about the incentives for both vehicles and charging. You know, Vanessa mentioned the Clean Cars for All program, but even again, like a personal example, I remember about last year, my cousin got into a car accident and needed to replace her vehicle. And she posted about it on Facebook. So I put the link for our local Clean Cars for All program in the South Coast area. And the URL, the address on it was some ungodly, you know, undecipherable thing. She actually thought that my profile had been hacked. I'm like, no, this is actually an incentive program to give you up to $9,500. And unfortunately, she did not go with an EV. I think she did not click on the link, which, given the proliferation of Facebook hacking, actually might have been the safest decision. But unfortunately, that I think could have helped push her in the direction of getting an EV. There's also a lot of charger incentives from our local utilities as well that people don't know about. A lot of these incentives you have to hunt for and have to really go out there and look for. There is a website that California has that does aggregate a lot of this information, a lot of the data, Drive Clean CA, but unfortunately you have to really know about it in order to look for it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I heard yesterday at the Infrastructure Strike Force meeting as well that sometimes rebate programs don't work very well, because then you have to have the money up front in order to pay for it first and then get the rebate later. Well, if you don't have the money up front, how do you even, be able to access the rebate?
Exactly. And sometimes the approval, like for the CVRP program, which is the mainstream main market rebate program, is about 100 and some odd days. So Right. So yeah, very, very good points. Thank you all. So I had a question from the chat for Andrea. What role do building codes play to ensuring equitable access to charging, and what would an equitable code look like?
That's a great question. And I think that building codes can play a really, really powerful role in ensuring equitable access. For example, as I'm sure almost everybody on this call knows, in California, right, the new Cal Green Building Code was passed in December, which mandates a certain percentage of parking spots in new multifamily dwelling construction be allocated for EV charging. That is a great first step. Unfortunately, that code only covers new construction, and so there's a lot of existing apartment buildings and existing parking lots that are not covered by that. But that's an example of how policy that is in name focused on something else, right, is focused on sort of building and construction rules, can be a really, really powerful tool for improving and equitizing access to EV chargers. And it would be great if, particularly at the municipal and state level, which is where I really think that we've got a lot of policymaking power when it comes to EVs, particularly in forward-thinking states like California, right? Like if departments of transportation, departments of housing, departments of buildings, et cetera, were really taking the lead in terms of thinking about like, okay, these are the spaces that we have jurisdiction over, right? The sidewalk, the curb, the parking lot, et cetera. How can we make these spaces places that function as resources for folks that need more access to EV charging? Obviously, there's a lot of work being done at the federal level. EVs are a real focus of the US DOT's policy priorities right now, but that rollout's usually pretty slow, and they've got to deliver funding to all 50 states. So, I think any work that can be done, within the state or even at the municipal level can be really, really, really effective and powerful.
Okay, I've got a lot of questions in the chat. Why don't we do, I'll do the next one I see here is for the panel. What would a successful community charging solution look like to them? And what are the holistic pieces needed to achieve success? Let's see, why don't we start with Chris for that one?
Sure. So in terms of local projects, I'm not super well informed about that, but one of the and actually, I was taking a quick look at the participants, and one of my friends who's actually on today's call mentioned the idea where you have for public charging for those that don't live in a multifamily dwelling with a garage, that where you have a public charging project where people can use it during the day, but at night limiting it to just folks who live in the specific neighborhood. So that people can charge their EV if they live in the local community. He could do a much better job of explaining it than I can, probably later on in the breakout sessions if he's able to stay. But in any case, I think that that's really looking at trying to find ways where you do have to serve the public, but you also need to have at a certain point a focus on the local community and having a real nexus to the folks who live locally. Being able also to avoid perceptions of gentrification is going to be very important. Making sure that you're going in with community support, you're going in with community engagement, and really ownership of some of these of this effort, because many of the communities, particularly the ones that are being squeezed the most by the high cost of housing, whether that is single family home or rental housing, there's going to automatically going to be concerns, okay, why, what's this going to have an effect on my rent? What's this going to have an effect on our local community? So being able to go in to address those concerns and being mindful of those concerns is going to be very important for state and local agencies going into the future.
See, Vanessa, did you have any thoughts about that as well?
Sure. Yeah, I have some quick comments here because I know we're approaching the end of the session. So beyond just the initial access to EV charging within multifamily spaces, I think it's really important to note the workforce development piece as well, which provides more long-term support to maintenance and the longevity of the infrastructure as well, and also provides opportunities for local community members to have access to different technology opportunities, to be more comfortable, supporting the maintenance of that and just getting more familiar with different technology as it gets deployed. So I think that's another important element to note beyond, getting the actual chargers on the ground and utilized is, training people to maintain them so that they can be used longer than those first couple years and really, benefit from the financial savings, both from utilizing the chargers, but also from maintaining them.
Okay, thank you so much. So we've got maybe just a couple minutes left. Do we have closing remarks from the panelists? Just any other closing thoughts on things we need? I mean, equity and access to charging is huge. I mean, I think Andrea, you put it very well in the beginning. It really is kind of about, if you have a charger, in your parking space at your apartment building, you're going to think, oh, well, hey, I could get an EV. I could just park it right here. It's going to change your mindset instead of, why you like, instead of thinking, can I afford one? Where can I even charge it? If the access is there, you're going to think that you can do it, which is a huge bridge. And also I do think there's a lot about not only access to charging, but access to information about where there's money, where there are people that can help in this transition. And I think that piece sometimes gets lost in the kind of higher level discussions at in the policy community and at the state agencies. And there's a disconnect between what the actual community members need. So I really appreciate everyone's thoughts and comments on this. I just open it up to you for any other closing remarks.
Sure, I'll make a quick plug for California SB 1482, which is being supported by the co-hosts of this conference. And this is a really great and crucial step, right? A really important legislative step in ensuring access to EV chargers. It requires that all newly constructed multifamily dwellings in California provide every resident who has a parking space access to EV charging. So, this is taking the requirements beyond the requirements of the Cal Green Code, and I think is certainly not a perfect bill and doesn't address many of the extant challenges that we see with access to EV charging, but I think is something that is a great step. I linked it in the chat earlier, and I will link it again. But I really urge all and to take steps to really support this bill and to also educate their local officials about the importance of access to EV charging in every community. So thanks so much for everyone for all this great activity in the chat and for being with all of us here today.